Hi, folks. We're just giving everyone a few seconds to get logged in. If you are already in here, you can find some information in the chat about how to buy tonight's featured book, The Vapors, and how to get 15% off if you buy it through greenlightbookstore.com within the next week. So go into the chat to find that information. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to welcome you to our new online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with David Hill about his new book, The Vapors, A Southern Family, the New York Mob, and the rise and fall of Hot Springs, America's forgotten capital of vice. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. I just have a couple of housekeeping things for you. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. The exact location depends on what kind of device you're using. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a couple different functions we'll be using throughout the event. The first one is the chat icon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in here throughout the event. Say hello to the authors, comment on what's happening in the conversation, provide some applause after the reading or at high points in the talk. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with your fellow attendees. You'll also see down at the bottom of your window a icon labeled Q&A. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, you can post your question in the Q&A module at any point during the event, and we'll be pulling all our questions from here towards the end of tonight's event to ask David. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And tonight's featured book, The Vapors, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. for shipping or curbside pickup. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And as a special bonus, we're offering 15% off when you purchase the book in the next week. Look for that coupon code and that book buy link in the chat. Our hosts for this evening are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of, and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. David is a former editor at Deadspin. He previously worked at Vice Sports, and his writing has appeared in The New Republic, New York Food and Wine, Hazlitt, The New York Daily News, and The New Yorker. He is not the David Roth from Van Halen or Magic. They'll be speaking with our featured author, David Hill. He's a writer from Hot Springs, Arkansas. His work has appeared regularly in Grantland and The Ringer. He's been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, GQ, and New York Magazine, as well as on This American Life. He lives in Nyack, New York, with his wife and 3 children, where he serves as the vice president of the National Writers Union. His new book, The Vapors, is a riveting work of forgotten history and an arresting glimpse into a bygone era of American vice. David Hill will start us off the reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Patrick and David Roth and with all of you. David, please take it away.
So, since this is ostensibly a sports show, I chose a reading that might be the only sports-related part of the whole book. It's this section where my father, whose name is Jimmy, has his first fight, his first boxing Golden Gloves boxing match, and just by way of explanation, the other character in this section, whose name is Oni Madden, is a kind of a big time New York. It's kind of a big time New York gambling or crime boss that's in Arkansas running the illegal gambling operation there. And this takes place in November 1959. Jimmy Hill was 13 years old when he laced up his gloves in a dim corner of the boys' club gymnasium for the first time. He was nervous, but not terribly so. A few butterflies in the belly were natural. This was his debut in the ring, after all. That didn't mean it was his first fight. Down at the newspaper offices where Jimmy occasionally worked a paper route on his bicycle, the overnight shift workers would pay him to fight bigger kids in the lot in the back, then book bets on the fights. Jimmy took a lot of beatings to amuse those guys. He gave a few, too. Oni Madden missed the fight something fierce. He loved the fight so much he'd risked getting tossed out of the country once back in 1940 when he violated his parole and snuck off to New York to see Buddy Bear fight Nathan Mann in Madison Square Garden. Less of a risk taker these days, he opted to watch the Sugar Ray Robinson and Carmelo Basilio fight in a movie theater in Little Rock, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't like being ringside, like in the old days when he kept company with big-time prize fighters. It wasn't like being within earshot of the trainers pounding the mat and pleading with their fighters to watch for the hook. In the front row of the raucous crowds, the rising and palpable tension all around him, the din of 1,000 fans bellowing their appreciation of a knockout nobody saw coming. In Hot Springs, the closest Oni could get to the feeling of the old days were the Golden Gloves youth fights at the boys' club. He came to care so much for watching the local youngsters fight that he regularly fronted the money to keep the boys' club up to snuff with new equipment and suitable facilities. The fights at the boys' club weren't as spirit-stirring as the professional bouts of his past life, but every now and then they provided a satisfactory dose of violence. Jimmy stood in his corner across from his opponent and sized him up. The boy looked older than Jimmy, maybe a high schooler, and clearly a practiced boxer, warming up in his corner by throwing combinations at the air. The high schooler was joined by an adult, some kind of coach perhaps, maybe even his father. Jimmy stood motionless and alone in his corner. Nobody came to see his first fight. Hazel was working, or maybe she wasn't. Jimmy never knew where she was unless she was passed out at home. For a short spell after Hazel's arrest, things seemed to improve. She'd keep food in the cupboards. She'd give him and Larry money for clothes or whatever else they needed. What she didn't do was leave Jack. It was only a matter of time before she slipped back into their old routine, back into that dark place that had taken her and would never give her back without a fight. The fights at the citywide Golden Gloves tournament consisted of 3 one-minute rounds. Most of the kids in the tournament were, like Jimmy, untrained and coaxed by an adult or a friend into entering. The typical fight started with both boys flailing their arms from the opening bell and ended with the judges picking a winner based on who looked less beat up than the other boy. The goal, Jimmy thought to himself, was to just stay on his feet. If he didn't get knocked down, he might be able to advance. When the bell sounded for Jimmy's fight, he didn't flail his arms as he had seen the other boys do. He put his fists in front of him, tightened his guts up, and prepared for the older boy's blows to come. The other boy jabbed right through Jimmy's guard, right into his face. The glove connected square with Jimmy's nose and snapped his head back. It stunned Jimmy, but it didn't feel like getting belted in the nose behind the newspaper warehouse where the boys hit him with bare knuckles and split open his lips, opened up his nose like a faucet, knocked him to the pavement, unable to catch a breath. Compared to those beatings, these didn't feel like punches at all. He could handle these. The older boy's hands were loose, and he was landing punches all up and down little Jimmy's body. Jimmy just took it. Then Jimmy finally saw an opening to throw his own blow, a right hook to the older boy's rib cage. The boy went skittering off in the direction of the punch, as if Jimmy had shoved him across the ring. He hit the ropes and shot his coach or father or whomever a look that said, "What in the devil was that?" Jimmy chased the boy to the ropes and threw another punch, then another. The boy backed away from Jimmy until his back touched the turnbuckle. He was in the corner. He was in a bad place. The crowd cheered little Jimmy on. "Go get him! Knock him out!" Jimmy obliged the cheers and charged the corner, throwing punches with both hands, moving left and right on his feet to keep the older boy pinned in. The boy put his arms up in front of his face, trying to stay on his feet to survive the 1-minute round. Only that minute never came. The blows became too much for the older boy to bear. He dropped to his knee. The referee started counting. The boy waved him off. "No need to count. I quit." Jimmy took no great pleasure in his victory. Hazel had raised her youngest son, despite everything, to be a kind, soft-hearted boy with an acute sense of fair play. He was one of the poorest children in his entire class, wearing the same clothes to school day after day, fueled on a breakfast of bread, sugar, and water. But Jimmy was popular and loved by his classmates, and he came to hold their friendships as sacred. Hazel and Jack didn't pay him and Larry any mind for the most part. Paulus Jr. was away in the service and hadn't looked in on them in some time. He had a family of his own now, too. He had left a girl in New Mexico with child when he went overseas, and now there was a baby boy waiting for him when he got back. So Jimmy leaned hard on his school friends to keep him grounded, to have their parents cart him around, to feed him when he was hungry, to keep him company when he felt most alone. In return, Jimmy offered them one thing he could afford, his unwavering loyalty. He expressed that loyalty the same way he won his first boxing match, by using his body to inflict pain. Jimmy had a friend in school named Judy Harrod. Her father was the town veterinarian, and they lived way out of town on the lake. Jimmy didn't see her much outside of school, but she was always kind to him, and he liked her quite a bit. She had a boyfriend, whom Jimmy also knew and played sports with. Whenever it was just the boys, that boy would say all sorts of terrible things about Judy, things he thought impressed the other boys. Jimmy didn't care for it. He didn't think it was fair to Judy to have some boy who was supposed to be her sweetheart talk about her the way he did. So one day in the schoolyard, when the boy went up to talk to Judy, Jimmy stopped him. About a dozen of Jimmy's friends stood around Judy in a circle with their arms crossed so the boy couldn't get to her. Judy had no idea what was going on. Jimmy told the boy he better not ever talk to Judy again or he'd knock him out. After that day, Jimmy became Judy's new sweetheart. But even Judy didn't make it to the boys' club to cheer Jimmy on in the Golden Gloves. He sat on a chair all by himself and waited for his next bout. When the time came, Jimmy climbed back into the ring and waited some more. The boy who was supposed to fight him didn't show up. The boys' club director was running around the room trying to hustle up a fighter to take his place. "You want to fight this kid?" he asked one older boy. "You're bigger than him." "Are you kidding me?" the kid replied. They gave Jimmy the trophy after just one fight. At the end of the night, the fighters and their friends lingered outside of the boys' club. Only Madden pulled up in his long Buick. "Does anybody need a lift?" he asked. The boys all piled into the big car. Oni cared about the young men at the boys' club served, the ones most in need of an outlet, the ones without much else in the community to tether themselves to, the ones like Jimmy Hill. Oni had said before that he didn't see himself as a role model. He complained that newspapers elevated bad men into big shots. When the wife of journalist Leonard Lyons found herself in a golf foursome in Hot Springs with Oni and Chicago mob boss Frank Nitti, she asked Oni what lessons from his life could benefit young boys in America. "The only way I can help boys is financially," he replied. When she argued that we all can learn from the lives of famous people, Oni dismissed her with, "From the famous, yes, but not the infamous." After taking the boys to Cook's for ice cream, Oni headed down West Grand to drop them at their homes. As they passed Oni and Agnes's house, one boy remarked, "That's where that mean man lives." "Who told you that?" Oni asked, surprised. "My mama," the boy said. "She told me to stay away from there. Says he's mean." "Well, maybe he's not as mean as they think he is," Oni said. They drove the rest of the way in silence.
Very nice. Very nice.
I thought it was fine.
You think everything's fine?
It's fine.
You sent an email that said this book absolutely whips. So.
I did. Yeah, I'm gonna stop being coy. I think the book's great. I read that passage last night. That was one of the last things I read before I went to bed, and I'm glad you read it. It's one of my favorite little bits from it. Not just because it's got sports, and I love sports.
Gambling is sports.
But yeah, it's true. Yeah. And so is I guess you could say crime.
Crime is sports.
One of our older sports. But yeah, you should set that up, Patrick. I don't need to explain what all that is doing in there.
Well, since the book is just came out, why don't you just explain the 3-character structure that you went with, which works really well, and your personal connection to the 3-character structure.
So the book's about Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is the place where I grew up. And Hot Springs is a city that, for most of the last century was the largest gambling operation in America. But what's sort of remarkable about that is that gambling was illegal in Arkansas that entire time. But, Hot Springs really rivaled Las Vegas before Las Vegas was Las Vegas, and was potentially set to become Las Vegas before Las Vegas was Las Vegas. And so I wanted to write a book about Hot Springs, but I wasn't really sure how to do it. I don't come from a family of people that were important or anything that were, an important part of that history. So this book, but I did want there to be some sort of, I wanted to have some kind of personal entry into this work. So I tell the story through three people's lives. My grandmother, Hazel, who shows up in Hot Springs in the early 30s as a teenager. And then Oni Madden, who you see in that section I just read, who was a famous crime boss in New York during Prohibition. He was a British gangster who came to New York and was, became a very powerful crime leader there, and ran the Cotton Club and managed a lot of famous actors and athletes.
And
he
killed a
killed
few
people, and he goes to jail for murder. And when he gets out of prison for murder, he kind of lands at the Hot Springs and kind of becomes the mob's man in Arkansas, so to speak. And then the third character is this man Dane Harris, who was a local guy, son of a bootlegger, who grows up in Arkansas and sort of slowly climbs the political and economic ranks in the city to become the boss of the town, become kind of what's known as the boss gambler of Hot Springs. And so I tell these three stories kind of in parallel, and then they eventually all intersect at this one club called the Vapors that Dane builds in the 1960s that becomes kind of a literal and a figurative flashpoint for the gambling business there.
It's interesting to me that this is your first book, but it also feels like the book you were born to write. I mean, have you been thinking about this story? Because I knew I knew of Hot Springs, but I thought it was more of a Depression era Capone. I had no idea that up until the early 60s, I mean, not long before I was born, this was the gambling center. And I'm just wondering, as a writer, since when you first started, have you had in your head, I want to tell the Hot Springs story at some point?
Yeah, I mean, as I got to learn the Hot Springs story, it certainly became, more and more something I wanted to write. But yeah, I mean, I guess where I first started thinking about writing this book was when the first piece I ever wrote for Grantland was a story about
Grantland.
Yeah, it was a story about Oak Lawn Park in Hot Springs, and I worked some of my family history into that piece, and also told some of the city's history with the mob and everything in that piece. And the reaction to that piece wasn't like, oh, this guy's such a great writer. It was, what is this weird ass place that you're from? And tell me everything about it. So I think I knew right away that like there was some real curiosity and interest. Once I would start to tell people a little bit about this story of Hot Springs, they'd want to know more and more. So I knew there was something there. It took me a long time to figure out how it was a book, but and then even once I sold the proposal for the book, it took me a long time to figure out how to make it a book.
I knew of it also. My wife is from Tulsa, and her family used to vacation in Hot Springs in the 70s, so it was still a destination. She lost her Snoopy fishing pole there. What did you know about Hot Springs, Dave? What
Very little, like what you were saying. I mean, I sort of thought of it as like, like a faded sort of, like I knew that, there was gambling and there was a horse track and stuff. I think probably most of what I now feel like I knew about it was from having read Dave's story like a few years ago. But that it sort of, I thought of it in the same way that I think of like Asbury Park in New Jersey, in the sense that it was like a place that had been before, we sort of like, before leisure became this like sort of massive, like before Las Vegas was Las Vegas, or like, every region had a place like this. So I knew that this was like kind of like the Southeast's like capital of this, but I didn't really know what that meant. Like for Asbury Park, like Dave and I are of similar ages, that like it was so down at heel by the time I first went there, even as a little kid, that like it was, there were old buildings still standing, but they were abandoned. They were abandoned in the 80s. And so the idea of going back and sort of doing this archaeology of the place. I mean, what was it like when you were a child, Dave? Do you remember like where it was in that sort of decline stage?
Yeah, I'd say it was pretty much in the nadir. I mean, gambling actually, exists in Hot Springs until about 1969. And so, by the time I'm born, they're like, less than a decade out of that. And the 1980s was really like, I think in a lot of ways the nadir, because the community had struggled through the 1970s to figure out how to keep their sea legs after having lost their main industry. I mean, like overnight, having just pulled out right from under them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in the 70s, I think it was on its way down, but by the 1980s hits, I think it was really at its nadir. And so Hot Springs was a weird place in the 80s. I mean, it tried to reinvent itself, you know, into like a family-friendly vacation resort, you know, where you could bring your Snoopy fishing pole and you know, they had theme parks, and they opened up a theme park, and they wanted to attract people to come in, and you know, they had like a passion play on the side of the mountain and everything. They wanted it to be like a you know, Christian, like family-friendly, but that didn't really take, you know, because I mean, it wasn't going to provide the same source of tourists and revenue that casino gambling had always done. And even in the 1980s, I mean, the horse racing was still a big draw to the community. So when I grew up in Hot Springs, horse racing was a big part of our life. It was the one part of the year where everybody made money. You know, it was something everybody always looked forward to. Our sort of calendar revolved around, you know, when the horses were running and when they weren't.
Was it still, you mentioned in the book that the population of the town would double during the race meet back at the peak. Was that still going on into the 80s, or was it like? It was, because, you know, the thing about horse racing back then was if you wanted to see the horses and bet on them, you had to be at the track, because they didn't have simulcasting and all that kind of technology. Oh, yeah, that's right.
That technology is what really led to racetracks around the country losing a lot of their, you know, their on-track customers. So back even in the 80s, people still, real hardcore horse players just traveled with the horses. So it was definitely still a big draw. But having said all that, you know, one of the things I just wrote something about this just this week for the Daily Beast, and it's like one of the things I mentioned was that, like, when I was a kid, there were 7 strip clubs in Hot Springs, and we only had 26,000 people in the town. That's a lot of strip clubs. I mean, you know, it really was sort of like struggling to figure out what to do. And I think a lot of people left. You know, I think after gambling, a lot of people left the community. A lot of money left the community, and so you know, and I think people were encouraging their children to leave too, you know, when they graduated, to go in search of jobs in places that they could earn money. So that flight out of the community really hurt it. I think that's all changing now. You know, I think that Hot Springs is a much different place now than it was in the 1980s. It's a much better place. And it's a really kind of, we lived there for a year while I was writing the book.
Yeah, I was going to ask to go back as an adult, because you've been away since school, I guess, right?
Yeah. After I graduated high school, I left and didn't come back. And so, yeah, my family moved down there for a year to finish the book. And it was really cool to be there. And it really was nothing like what I remembered, you know? I mean, it had changed in so many ways for the better, really. It's not to say that it's nothing like it was in the 60s for sure, but it's all, you know, it's a different kind of community now. It's much more of a kind of there's a bit of an artsy culture there, you know. It's more of a it has more of a cultural center to it than you know, it being whatever you want to call it, like a vice capital like it once was. But,
yeah, there's something funny about the idea of, like, you know, the healing waters and, like, the, you know, all the stuff you can breathe in to make yourself feel better, like that. All of that was basically pegged to getting like that was hangover cure shit for everybody that went there. It seemed like that was like the decadence to it, in the same way that, like, you know, whatever, a beautiful beach in Asbury Park was mostly just an excuse to go and, like, kind of get fucked up.
Miners bathing before they had met the prostitutes. You want to be clean.
Yeah,
right. It's funny. It was interesting to me that, like, venereal diseases was one of the main things that they asked to treat, and I don't know what that was about. I wonder if that was just doctors that, like, didn't want to deal with it, so they were like, you know what you should do? Just go sit in the bath, you know, in Hot Springs. But that was a big one. That's why Al Capone, you know, was because of his syphilis. I mean, venereal disease was a big one. And it's also weird that, like, these were communal baths, and so to know that so many people you were having a schwitz with were in there for their venereal disease must have, I don't know, I guess they didn't worry about it back then.
What was it, as someone, I don't write a ton of personal stuff, just, I don't think I'm that good at it, and I had a pretty mundane existence for most of my life, but what was it like mining your family history? How much of it did you know, like the sort of gritty stuff about your grandma? How much did you know? What was it like talking? And was it hard, easy, fascinating? I'm just curious about mining your own sort of family history, you know, all the skeletons in the closet, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I knew a little bit about what my grandmother was dealing with, but I didn't know nearly as much as I learned writing the book. And so I learned quite a bit, and it was an interesting process. You know, I think when I started out interviewing people for the book, and I'd tell folks that I was writing this book about my grandmother, people that knew her, you know, they'd say, "Oh, bless your heart," and then they'd go into telling me what a wonderful woman she was, and they'd tell me all these stories about what a great mom she was and everything. And I'd let them, whatever, blow all that sunshine up my ass. And then once they were done, I'd say, "Look, I know this, and I know that, and I already know this." And then they'd realize, then their facial expression would change. They realize, like, oh, he already knows the real deal. So then they'd start to, open up and tell me more. But people really they were protective of her. They wanted to protect a lot of that from me because I was her grandson, and they didn't know how much I was, sort of they didn't know what my perception of her was. And I think people still were protective of her because I was writing a book too. But, I think in the end, people trusted me to like handle with her with as much care as anybody else would, since she was my grandmother. And I really tried to do that, although it wasn't always easy. I definitely think my feelings towards her changed a lot over the course of learning a lot about her and writing this book. And I try not to judge her, but I also try not to
Did you know her?
Pass. Yeah, I know her. There's a picture of us in the book, a picture of us together in the book. I mean, I knew her as a child, and she died in the early 90s. But when I was a kid, she used to babysit my sister and I a lot. And I spent a lot of time in her trailer growing up. And, in fact, it's, hanging around her. At the end of the vapors, at the end of the book, I guess I'm spoiling it for folks who haven't read, but at the very end, she gets with this carny and they run off together. And that guy was the guy that I was raised as my grandfather, right? And so I was raised by, when I would hang out with her and her later husband, were hustlers, they were con artists. They traveled around with the carnival. Back then, the carnival was basically a casino, right? Like, even in the 1980s, like the carnival was just a roving, rigged casino. And so, she and her husband were like, they ran a game called Razzle Dazzle, and they would, essentially scam people. And they were criminals. They'd steal cars and shit. So like, even as a kid, I was around a little bit of this stuff, but she had kicked a lot of the drugs, and she had kicked the drugs. I mean, I don't know how much she was drinking. She certainly never drank around me, but I was raised around a lot of interesting stories, and, I can remember her trailer and a lot of the, like, matchbooks and, ashtrays from a lot of these clubs. I always had this feeling, just growing up in Hot Springs generally, there was always this feeling that I knew that there was another world that existed there once upon a time, and that it was all just kind of like hidden. Like, I had this memory being at a friend's house, and his dad had a craps table in his house that was like covered up, and we weren't allowed to look under and mess with it. It was just like left over from the casino days, or people would have slot machines in their garage that were collecting dust. It was like there were, there's just this like this one layer of dirt and stone that had piled upon, the remnants of the gambling days. And that, as a kid growing up, I could sense that it was there, but people didn't talk about it. You know what I mean? It was a little bit of a,
was it generally in the state, was it sort of, did you get the sense in the book that it was an embarrassment to the state? It was like just something they wanted, not because one really interesting thing about your book is the way the politics shake out, segregation, gambling, the way the politics line up is very interesting. And I guess they just wanted to bury it all together. They were fine with the segregation, just get rid of the cards.
Yeah, well, Arkansas, even during the time of gambling in Hot Springs, the rest of the state of Arkansas was still a fairly Baptist state, right? And so, there was a bit of like, around the rest of the state, there was a bit of like, like pearl clutching about what was going on down in Hot Springs by people in other parts of the state who were offended by it. But there wasn't much they could do because their governors, just a successive line of governors were just paid off to like say, that's their problem down there. They'll deal with it in Hot Springs. The rest of us don't worry about it. It wasn't until Orville Faubus became very unpopular on both flanks that the wheels started to come off the wagon, right? And that was when people to his right, which, means people who were Democrats but were more racist and segregationist than him, started to challenge him because
the classic standard of more racist than literally Orville Faubus.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Orville got pulled more and more in that direction. I think I tell in the book about how his dad, Orville's dad was a socialist. Orville went to a communist college called Commonwealth in Arkansas. Orville Faubus was educated to be a lawyer in a a college run by communists, and his dad was a party member and was a very, adamant. And Orville first got elected as a populist, and took, he was popular because he took on the electric company. But he got pulled more and more in that direction, so far so that I write in the book about how his dad kind of disowned him and wrote letters to the editor saying how embarrassed he was about him. So, but he got pulled in that direction by, more ardent segregationists who really thought that he was too kind and he was, didn't take a tough enough approach. And so one of the issues that they hung around his neck while they were trying to take him out was gambling. And not only gambling, but liquor. Liquor was also a big issue because you couldn't sell it by the glass back then. So that was happening in Hot Springs too. And, so he had to make all these accommodations in order to keep his job. And then he ends up getting beat by a Republican who also is anti-gambling, but is pro-civil rights, right? So on both flanks of Orville Faubus, people were using gambling as a cudgel to take him out of office. And I think that's what ended up doing these guys in Hot Springs was that it just became an untenable situation without a governor in your pocket.
There's something really interesting about the way that, in the same way that sort of, the vapors themselves or the hot springs themselves are like the reason why the city is where it is. But there's the force of that demand for gambling and partying and, whatever, like all of the things that basically made people go there, that made the city what it was, is itself like this endlessly renewable resource that it seems like throughout the book, there's all these different characters who are, in some ways, like your grandmother, it seems like the proximity to it really made her life a lot harder. I mean, that like, yeah. And yet there's also there's so much money being thrown off. There's so much interest in it from, everywhere in the state and out, that like there's something to the way that market works that felt very sort of contemporary, in the way that like that the essential human sort of desires for these things being exploited in different ways by different people to the extent possible. Like there's something about that like, to what extent does that like resonate to you as like somebody that is, for instance, paying attention to the way that things are now?
Well, I mean, when you think about now, it's a little bit of it's almost like we can't even compare it, right? Because we have casino gambling in 40 something states now. Mm-hmm. It's almost like been asked and answered. And also the other thing that I think is interesting about now, looking at, the way things are today compared to back then, is that, Las Vegas happened. And I think that one of the things I try to show in my book is what a like insane thing it is that Las Vegas happened, right? That like this city that wasn't even, this place that didn't even have like a sewer or any electricity. I mean, there wasn't even a paved road. I mean, there was one paved road in all of Las Vegas in like 1957. Yeah. And 3 years later, they're spending $20 million on, building a casino resort there. This is something that I think people don't understand, is that like, it really went from nothing to something really big overnight. And, and I try to tie that to things like the Cuban Revolution and everything. But Hot Springs was a place that was kind of positioned and poised to accept all that money and become that. There is like this history of like spas, like those kinds of, like Baden-Baden or Monte Carlo or whatever, becoming, these resorts where people, when they bring in all these tourists because people like to go to where the like spa is. And then the tourist trade develops and builds up around that tourist traffic, right? Which involves gambling, prostitution, hotels, all that kind of stuff. Entertainment grows around where tourists are. And it used to be that the cart followed the horse, right? That like people would go to this place because it was actually nice. And then the industry would build around that. But Las Vegas is the opposite. It's a terrible place. There's no reason to go there. Why would anybody ever go there? Instead, it's like the cart before the horse. People go there because that's where someone built all the gambling, because it was the only place that you could go do gambling anymore because of this 20-year period of the government trying and succeeding at criminalizing and shutting down gambling all around the rest of the country.
Yeah, there's a great bit on Vegas in around the middle of the book where you're talking about, I guess, Oni Madden going there. And the drive from Los Angeles is described in all these cars that didn't have air conditioning yet. So they had this terrible sounding, what was it called? Like a bog fan? Swamp cooler, which is, you want to lay out what that is? Because it's actually somehow even worse than it sounds.
It's like a funnel that you put on the window of your car, and the hot air outside of the car blows into this funnel, into this like I don't know, like a sponge or something, and it's supposed to blow like air with moisture on it into the car to cool you off, but it was just, all it did was make people like hotter and muggier
for 5 hours.
For hours as they drove down the road. I mean, it was just like the experience was just so harrowing. Everybody hated it. And Meyer Lansky is who I talked about going there. And Meyer Lansky hated Las Vegas. He hated it so much. He thought it was the most miserable place on the planet. And he really struggled because, you know, the revolutionaries kicked him out and threw him out with all his money. He needed to put his money somewhere. He really didn't want to put it there, but in the end he had to make a smart choice because that was where it was legal.
Yeah.
And he, you know, it's clear that he much would have preferred to put his money into Hot Springs, where it was actually, you know, a nice place to visit.
So you mentioned swamp cooler. The details in this book are amazing, but there's also, now I need to know, one, what does this mean? And two, are these general Arkansas isms? There's a lot of Dan Rather on election night kind of stuff in this book. And my favorite is, let me get it right, bell clapper in a goose's ass. What does that mean?
No, just some people say. That was when,
means what it sounds like, Patrick. Come on.
It's just like, that's when they're running off. They're taking off, right? Like they don't waste any time to get up and out of there. Yeah, I mean, some of the, I'll tell you, I'll tell an embarrassing story, but the first draft of the book had a lot more of that kind of shit in it. And I wrote the first draft. I mean, when I was down in Arkansas, I was reading a lot of like Southern fiction, and particularly like Southern Gothic fiction, and I probably shouldn't have done that. But the first draft of this book, I really wrote it trying to write it in this like voice of like a Southern writer, which, you know, I regret. And but luckily that's why we have editors, right? And that's, you know, my editor read it and he was like, well, let's not do this. But
you thought it was purple, or you felt like, what was the?
It was a different version of purple, right? Because it wasn't like I was trying to sound. I certainly wasn't trying to sound like I was like a fanciful writer or anything, but I definitely wanted it to sound Southern, right? I wanted people, and the reason I did it was I wanted to remind people that you're reading this book about the mob and organized crime and gambling, and there are books like that exist, right? But this one's different because this one takes place in the, like, you know, whatever, the like syrupy South. And so I wanted there to be reminders as you read the book that the place that this is happening in is unique, right? And so in the first draft of the book, I did that by having the sort of narrative voice be very Southern, and I realized how stupid that was. And in the book that you read, I think I do that differently. Like, I have the voice of this of Millard Shields, this Pentecostal preacher who comes in and out of the book, and I think him, you know, I think is a stark reminder of the fact that, like, we're not in Chicago and we're not in New York, right? We're somewhere far from there. And so, you know, and also, like, you know, the Hazel sections of the book, I had some opportunity to be a little more colorful, to use a few more colloquialisms than I otherwise might have in some of
Are you using them in everyday conversation now? Because I would drop them all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a reputation for that, sure. I mean, it's funny because I've lived in New York at this point longer than I lived in Arkansas, right? And so I kind of am in a weird way, like a man with no nation, right? Like, when I go back to Arkansas, people think that I'm like, that I don't sound like, I sound like I'm from, you know, they think I've like developed some sort of New York accent, or that I don't, you know, it's like I'm not Southern enough there. But when I'm in New York or I'm around my wife's family, they think I'm the most countrified, you know, hillbilly they've ever met. So, you know what I mean? Like, it just depends on where I am. But yeah, I certainly have a reputation among the folks I keep company with up here in New York as someone who uses a lot of Southern colloquialisms, although, you know, I really don't think that I even scratch the surface of what it's like being back
My
home.
favorite of those, just to get on the record, is that the fancy casinos are called carpet spots because they had carpets, and including in the Vapors that is like the kind of the dream palace that that Dane Harris builds, including shag carpet by the bar, which I actually made a sound when I read that. The idea of just like thousands of people a night getting loaded, playing, gambling, and then just, but like a thick carpet that you need to just clean. And also they never go home because it's open for 24 hours. It's just harrowing.
And the number of cigarettes that must have been going.
Oh my God, dude. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, the carpet joint stands in contrast to what they would call a sawdust joint. So the cheaper, the sort of more proletarian casinos were called sawdust joints, and that's because they had wooden floors and they would just sprinkle sawdust on the floor to cover up the tobacco.
It's the old Irish way, the old Irish tradition.
Yeah. So you had sawdust joints and carpet joints.
I wanted to touch on something when I'm not sure, just so people understand. Where's my statistic here? So in 1962, Hot Springs is doing $200 million a year. All of Nevada casinos are only at $227 million. That's not that long ago. And then you mentioned that a woman writer, I believe it's a woman, for Holiday Magazine does a profile, and she says she's never been in a casino where people were having fun. That actually comes through in the book with the outside entertainment. I mean, that I wanted to visit that place in a way I've never really wanted to visit, like old Vegas, maybe to see Sinatra. But it sounds like they really had a good thing that they just let kind of go for all the other reasons. But it did sound like it was a hot time in the old town, as it were, super overly seedy, I guess.
So based on everything that I've read, it's clear that like the scene in Hot Springs was so different. It stood in marked contrast to the scene in Las Vegas. And it was much more similar to what was going on in Havana. Havana was the real American gambling capital at that period of time. That's where the mob was going in hard on building up Havana before the revolution. So throughout the 1950s, no one really gave a shit about Las Vegas. Meyer Lansky, he's putting his money into Cuba. But Hot Springs was much more like that. It was a much more of that kind of a scene where it was like a place where people went out and got dinner and danced and maybe did a little gambling or whatever. And Vegas was strictly like, it was such an effort to get there, and people went there just to gamble. And, it was just sort of a no frills kind of a scene. And people talk about Bugsy Siegel and the Flamingo, right? The Flamingo was this, like, if you've ever seen that movie, and the way that people have romanticized this, like, palace that he built and spent all this money to build this ritzy place with waiters wearing tuxedos and stuff like that and marble staircases. But the thing is, he built that, and then everybody went out there and they thought, this is stupid. Like, he was ridiculed for it. People were like, why did you do this? Why did you build this? Why did you spend all this money on this thing out here that doesn't make any sense? And then he gets killed, you know what I mean? Like, and it loses money when he opens it up. It just does nothing but lose money, and then they kill him over it. And then they quickly turn the Flamingo into a low roller joint. They put a buffet, the Gus Greenbaum and the people come in there. They put in a buffet. They they bring the limits down, because that's what it was going to take to really be a casino in Las Vegas. Hot Springs was a different situation. People brought their shows. Performers brought their shows to Hot Springs to premiere them before they took them to Broadway. You know what I mean? Like, they were like, well, we'll go and we'll test it in Hot Springs to make sure it works before we premiere it. It was really like on the map, So you're right. They definitely screwed up a good thing that they had going. And, they screwed it up in a lot of different ways, but the easiest thing they could have done was just legalize it. If they legalized it, we didn't know anything about Las Vegas right now. Nevada would be a silver mining state.
That's so crazy about it. In reading it, is it literally the only thing that Vegas had on it was that you didn't have to deal with the law, and yet
that's it.
Too much politics. People love it.
How much? Without spoiling too much, but late in the book and late in Hot Springs' existence, there's a series of bombings, or at least one lethal bombing, and a number of sort of blowing up cars or leaving, dynamite or just sort of laying around. How much did that? And it's unsolved, correct?
Well, I think I solved it, but I solved it. And I lean pretty heavy into who I suspect did it into the book, but I stopped short of just like calling him out. And I got really obsessed with this, right? One of my obsessions while I was writing the book was trying to solve the bombings and figure out who was behind this. And
you really fucking made it easy for yourself. Decided you were going to write it in Flannery O'Connor's voice and solve a 50-year-old crime just for yucks.
Yeah. And I was like, and my editor had to reel me back in from that too. He was like, he was like, no one cares, right? Like, he's like, no one cares who bombed the place. Just tell the story. Tell a good story. You don't have to solve it. But I was like, the cork board and the red string and everything.
Nice.
But in the end, I definitely drop a lot of I point pretty heavily at who I think did it. This cop that ends up becoming who runs the Bridge Street Club, and then he ends up you know, he blows up, I think he blows up Dane's house, and then Dane moves his family out, and this guy goes and buys the house and moves into it, right? His rival. But, you know, and I heard people, you know, I talked to a lot of people locally who suspected these people did it. And I had some Department of Justice files that showed who they were investigating. It really doesn't matter, right? But there was a string of bombings, and what I think is definitely true is that those bombings were the product of rival gamblers, right? People who, the group of people who were running the casinos had put out of business. And so they were trying to, you know, push these folks out so that they could take back over. What they essentially did, though, was they just sped the plow on how quickly the whole thing would get shut down, because the bombings and the violence that went on around this squabble between these two camps of would-be casino bosses really got a lot of the clergy upset. And so the Hot Springs religious community, you know, they were always okay with gambling. You know, I tell a few anecdotes in the book about, you know, church leaders in Hot Springs who were okay with it. But outside of this Hot Springs, the clergy were really circling the wagons. And then after the bombings, you start to see some of the anti-gambling preachers show up in Hot Springs, and they're being invited to preach from the pulpits of the Hot Springs churches. And that was when you knew that, like, this is over, you know? If the churches turned against them, they weren't going to be able to hold it together.
Where on the corkboard was easily offended young legendary sax man Bill Clinton, who just could not take the degeneracy.
Yeah. Evidently, he did not like being in the vapors. He couldn't handle it. He went there one night with his mother. Now his mother, for folks who don't know,
the family has a cameo in the book. Like, they're in this mix. But go ahead.
Bill Clinton grew up in Hot Springs. A lot of people think Bill Clinton's from Hope because he made a big deal about being born in Hope when he ran for president, because it sounds real nice to be a boy from a town called Hope. But he lived in Hope for like a minute. He grew up in Hot Springs. He graduated from Hot Springs High School. He was in the middle of all this shit. And Bill Clinton was, you know, I mean, you know, he was present for everything around the book. And him and my dad are the exact same age. They were born on the same day, and they were in the same class, and like knew each other. And I mean, I say they knew each other. I mean, everybody, you know, there's this thing in Arkansas called FOBs, like everybody's a friend of Bill. But
and your grandmother partied with his mother. I think that should be.
Yeah, and Virginia, Bill Clinton's mother, Virginia, was definitely, you know, she was a wild child. She loved all the casinos. She loved to party. She loved to gamble. And she, you know, the difference between Virginia and Hazel that I sort of point out in the book, though, is that my grandmother, who was very similar to Virginia, right? They were both single mothers. They were both the victims of domestic abuse. They both liked to drink and party and have a good time. But, you know, Virginia seemed to have her wits about her. I mean, she kept a job as anesthesiologist. You know, she was able to like provide, and Hazel really did, you know, Hazel kind of lost the thread at a certain point. But I'm getting off track here. There was a story that Virginia brought Bill to the Vapors and snuck him in to see somebody play saxophone because he was into the saxophone, and he hated it. He didn't like, he's reportedly didn't like being in there. It felt too kind of unseemly for him. So he never went back.
I mean, he was a square. He was definitely a square. There was a man who had a moral code.
Even the carpet joints, he was like, "Nah, this isn't for me."
I think that's what people back home would tell you about Bill Clinton, people that knew him, is that, you know, he had this reputation when he was running for president in the 90s. I mean, looking back on it now, we may scoff, but in the 90s, and when he went on Arsenio Hall and stuff, like, people thought, oh, this is like a cool guy, right? Like, he's like the cool presidential candidate, which is absolutely absurd to even say out loud today. But, you know, we can all, that's what it was like. And people in Hot Springs were like, this guy's not cool. He was a nerd. Like, he was really kind of, I think people in Hot Springs, as much as they loved him and they loved that he went from Hot Springs to become governor and then, by God, president, I think they also still understood that, like, Bill Clinton back in the day was, you know, he wasn't somebody that was like, you know, I mean, he was a good boy, you know, he studied, he made good grades, he was in the band, and he met the president. He went on and ran the world.
Yeah. Was it sports? We're going to get to, we only have one Q&A question, so we'll get to that in a second. But am I wrong? Was it Sports Illustrated where that sort of famous picture of him in a full University of Arkansas warm-up suit? Like in the Oval Office wearing, like, I have this memory of him maybe talking to Nolan Richardson's, but he was wearing the entire basketball warm-up suit. And it's like, yeah, that guy is he's that guy.
Yeah, just it's funny because like what Dave is saying is very recognizable to me, and yet the idea, like just hearing the phrase "the cool presidential candidate," you're just like, oh no, like there's no way, like you just the two don't go together.
He was the Beto. He was the Beto of
Yeah.
1992.
Like the Escape Lapucci of his era, skateboarding,
Yep.
periodically dropping a curse word.
Put a sock in it, Roy.
So we got a couple of questions. Do you want me to do
hold on, we have to do our clip. We have our everyday clip. Chelsea, please roll the greatest 4th and 25 play I've ever seen. And you gonna suey pig for us? Do we do that? I'm not a native.
It's Woo Pig Suey.
Sorry.
And no.
Oh boy.
We're lacking sound, but
you can tell what's happening. It's gonna get good.
Yep. Keep it going, boys.
There you go. I mean, 4th and 25 lateral back. And then they score.
Yeah.
I gave a talk last week. I don't remember who I was speaking to, one of these things that I was doing. And I talked about how this book that I wrote is, I think these characters, I was trying to think about what brings these characters together, the 3 characters book. And I said, well, the more I thought about it, the more I thought like, oh, it's ambition, right? Like that all 3 of these characters, they want something better than what they have. They've been told their whole lives they don't deserve anything better, you know, that they sort of, they strive for something that they probably they had no business striving for. And I felt like that was a very Arkansas type thing, right? That Arkansans have a chip on their shoulder about being from Arkansas. And I talked about the Razorbacks and how like, it's a perfect example. Like they for whatever reason, Arkansas insists on playing in the SEC, and they would rather get their brains beat in, you know, week in and week out, as long as they're getting beat by the best, right? Yeah. They could go play in Conference USA or something like that and win all the games. They want to be in the SEC. They want to be beat. They want to get whipped every week by the best. And I feel like that's a very Arkansas kind of thing. And that's what happens to the characters in my book. Like they strive for this thing that they believe they deserve, but they sacrifice a lot in pursuit of it, but they really get their butts whipped pretty bad in the book. So
something very in the good way, something kind of inspiring and American about the refusal to acknowledge that you are really more of a Conference USA guy than an SEC guy.
I'll never be able to show my face in Arkansas again after saying that.
We have a good question here from John Mark Bowling. As someone who grew up in Little Rock with a very faint idea of what Hot Springs actually was, this book has been a real revelation and a hell of a lot of fun. I thought it was interesting that the NYC kingpins had to bow to allow mom and pop local control of the individual casinos, and I would like you to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm a little bit like on this question of whether or not there was mom and pop control versus the mob having control. One of the things that I think I allude to in the book is that, I mean, it's important for folks who maybe haven't read the book to understand that like a primary to like this being okay for everybody in Arkansas, for them to have this like huge illegal gambling, wide open gambling operation, was for them to, the story they publicly told was, well, the mob doesn't run this, we run it, right? Just these local guys run it. We don't let the mob in. But I really think that that was a little bit of PR. You know, I think that it's clear that the mob ran every bit of gambling in America. And I think that's also true in Hot Springs. I mean, the fact that Oni Madden ran the wire service means that Oni Madden really did control gambling, because the wire service is literally a thing where you can switch, you can turn it off and then there's no more bets. You know what I mean? You turn it back on and then there's bets. And this is how the mob took control of gambling coast to coast, city to city, was once they had control of the wire, which they murdered a lot of people to get control of. You know, it used to be controlled by like square guys, and then they killed a bunch of people in brutal fashion in order to get it. So Oni's the wire guy in Hot Springs. That means Oni, you know, he rules the roost as long as he controls the wire. The same is true for the slot machines. The same is true for like who controls the gambling equipment. You know, they control
the credit you talk about in there too. Same thing. It's like the people with the deepest pockets. You have to.
Right. So I think that like the people that when Dane Harris tells Sports Illustrated, like this is a homegrown operation. I mean, I think that for them to buy that requires some naivete, because the mob controlled the infrastructure that allowed gambling to exist anywhere in America, right? And that was their biggest business. And that's why the government tried so hard for 20 years to shut them down, because it was making $9 billion a year for these corrupt, you know, these corrupt criminals who ran America. So I guess that's what I think is that, yeah, they had to come. There was a bit of this, like these local Southern guys who were saying, you can't own the casino here. You know, you can't come in and buy a casino, which they did. They ran a lot of guys out of town who came in and tried to like push their weight around. But they were only able to do that because Oni Madden lived in Hot Springs, right? I mean, if Oni Madden wasn't there and Oni Madden didn't have the blessing of Curly Humphreys and Sam Giancana and, you know, and Jerry Katana, then these local guys wouldn't have been able to throw their weight around like they were big swinging dicks. It would have been, you know, a different story. So
the next question is kind of two people. Well, the first question is from Jamal Rogers. What's your favorite story you had to cut from the book? And then we have kind of an ancillary from John Mark Bowling, who just asked our previous one. In addition to that, what's the best story you couldn't include due to the potential threat of a lawsuit? If you don't want to talk about that here, just know you don't have to. It's a safe space. No one needs to get sued, so we can have fun.
This is being recorded, so I
yeah.
don't know if I can trust that date.
But I bet you can do Jamal's at the very least.
Well, yeah, and I've been asked that. Everybody, you know, always asks that, and so I think my stock answer at this point has been that the story that I most regretted having to cut out was that there was you know, one of the sort of narratives of this book is that as the McClellan hearings and before that the Kefauver committee were shutting down gambling around the country, as each city falls, right, as they hold hearings and bring the FBI in and shut down gambling in city after city, Hot Springs grows, right? And one of Hot Springs' biggest rivals for many years was Newport, Kentucky, which was also a big gambling town in the 1940s and into the 50s. And Newport gets shut down, and the gangsters that ran Newport get desperate, right? And so this guy, Screw Andrews, immediately starts murdering black gambling bosses around Newport and Cincinnati and taking over their operations. And it's like a slaughter. Like he's just going through and killing one by one and taking their stuff. And so these sort of black gang leaders all start coming to Hot Springs to sort of regroup and figure out how they're going to deal with this. And then Screw chases them to Hot Springs. They have a big war and a big shootout, you know, in Hot Springs. And they find one guy's body right in front of Dane's house, all shot up with bullets. And so it's like, in a way, it's like this gang, we cut it out of the book because it felt like it was too far afield from our three main characters. But I thought it was important because it showed how these things that were happening in other parts of the country had this reverberating effect, right? And that it all ended up on Hot Springs' doorstep, whether it was dead bodies or whether it was the growth in the industry, like what was happening, what our senator, Arkansas Senator McClellan, was doing in other cities was helping Hot Springs gang leaders and gamblers, and it was hurting all these people around the rest of the country. And so I regretted that I had to cut all that whole narrative out. I also regret it because it was cool to show that, like, there was also, you know, there was an African-American sort of syndicate that ran in parallel to the white syndicate that we, you know about and have written about a lot, you know, about Meyer Lansky and his ilk. But I liked being able to show how there was also in parallel, there was this sort of black gambling business too. And you know, so I had to cut a lot of that out, but it was fun to research that and to show how much these things that happen around the country kind of showed up in Hot Springs.
Let's do one more real quick answer though, so we can wrap up, but I actually was curious about this too. The book ends with Oni dying and your grandmother ostensibly finding the Lord, at least a little bit. What happened to Dane?
Dane actually, he starts a casino in Turkey, in Istanbul.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that.
I knew it.
He partners with the guy who started the Holiday Inn hotel chain, who's from Memphis. And the guy approaches Dane. He's like, help me. I've got an opportunity with the Turkish government to start a casino in Istanbul. So Dane goes and he starts a Casino de Istanbul, and he flies junkets of gamblers, because Dane had this huge book of gamblers, of high rollers all over America. He starts flying them on private planes to Turkey to gamble. And so he does that for a while until there's a change in the government in Turkey, and then the new government in Turkey says, yeah, we don't want gambling, and they shut it down. And so Dane once again falls victim to pious political leaders.
It's a shame. I assume this will be coming to Prestige TV near you
yeah,
very
for real.
soon.
This is 3 seasons in a movie right here. Congrats, man.
So I have a few things to go through real quick before we wrap up. If you see, I'm wearing my Green Light is on Pause shirt. That was their cool design for COVID. Green Light is open. You can now go back in and talk to people and, you know, wear a mask. Don't be an idiot. And so that is good news. Second, the feedback for Squawkin Sports has been pretty solid. People seem to be enjoying it, but we'd like to spread the word. So if you have enjoyed these talks, which I looked around and I don't know that there's any other sort of sports authors, books, things going on. So please follow us, spread it around, let people know. Our next show is on the 29th, and it features noted sports writer, big-time Hollywood star Mike Birbiglia, who we will very quickly get through the sports and talk to him and his poetess wife, J. Hope Stein, who if you saw his Netflix special, which has one of the greatest comic sort of physical set pieces I've ever seen, which I won't do here, but if you watch the new one, which is the name of it, not just the new one, about their child, the book is an expansion on that with some new stories and a lot more of her poems, and her poems are great.
Also, not even trace amounts of sports, as I recall. From
there's like 2 mentions.
All right, yeah. If you like Dave's book but thought there was too much sports in it, really recommend the next one.
I said we're gonna figure out the Georgetown comedy mafia. Gaffigan is clearly Ewing. Mulaney, I don't know, Iverson, Nick Kroll. We'll have to figure that out. Lastly, you may have noticed I am amongst the woods. I'm back home in Montana. And the reason I'm back home in Montana is because my father died a couple of weeks ago. I'm from Billings. We are currently sitting in Big Sky. But to tie it to the Vapors, Dave's dad played college football. My dad also played college football, and they were both centers. My dad's football claim to fame, he was a backup center on Santa Clara, I'm going to say 60 to 62. And his lone start was when they went into San Quentin, longest yard situation. Apparently a lot of the starters had term papers that needed to be completed. So my dad got to start against the San Quentin, I don't know, tough guys. I don't know what their names. So he was a sports fan. I'm going to miss him. He was a good dude. He was a pediatrician in Billings for 45 years. Not perfect. None of us are. But he was definitely a great dad, an even better grandfather, and a pillar of the community. And I'm going to miss our yearly USC Notre Dame Irish whiskey bets. So if you could, here's to you, Dad. Yeah. Miss you. As always, thanks to David Roth. And thanks to Dave Hill, whose book is fantastic. And you should
It really is so good. I can't recommend it highly enough. Thank you both, man.
It has everything you need: sex, drugs, crime, and
carpet.
Mitzi Gaynor and Mitzi Gaynor.
Yeah.
Pentecostal preaching.
Yep.
Okay, Chelsea, take us out, please.
Thank you so much, Patrick and David, for tonight's wonderful, fascinating conversation. It was a pleasure listening to you guys. A reminder to everyone still with us. See the lovely illustration there on Patrick's screen. Reminder to everyone listening to us, if you happen to miss any part of this, or if you have friends or family who missed it, or like Patrick said, if you'd like to spread the word about the Squawkin Sports series and pull in more people, tonight's event has been recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube page, Greenlight Bookstore, in the next few days, and you can also find previous installments of Squawkin Sports up on our YouTube page. So go like, share, subscribe if you'd like to. Also a reminder that you can buy David Hill's book, The Vapors, through greenlightbookstore.com, or you can now come browse in our stores for it. If you buy online within the next week for shipping or curbside pickup, you can use code VAPORS to get 15% off. Thanks again, everyone, for spending your evening here on Zoom with us, and have a wonderful rest of your night. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night. Take care.